Once you work in prisons and you see the numbers of prisoners in a variety of jails, even though some of them committed very serious crimes, most haven't. Most prisoners are no different from just people you'd meet, your friends, anybody. And you understand, you get to learn pretty quickly that you could be where they are if life had dealt you a different hand. I think that if members of the public were really given proper information and engaged, in sort of Q&A, their view would change.
You grow up and the only reference point you've got is press reports and media hype. Until you actually have someone inside or go through it yourself, those are the only reference points you have. So you think further punishment is justified because these are bad people.
When you actually meet somebody and they're very different to the stereotypical view that you've had, you make your own judgment, and it's real because they're right in front of you, they're responding to you, you're interacting, and you because of that, it's first hand, it's not third hand for a newspaper.
Prison is made of not necessarily bad people, but people that have done bad things. So if you can see beyond the crime, well, then maybe you can actually help them.
There are, of course, a percentage of prisoners that come in who are Joe Bloggs down the road or your neighbour next door who has literally had a driving offence and has accidentally killed someone. I've heard many a time where someone's had a brawl in a pub and hit someone and they've tripped, smashed their head and died. Again, that's a life sentence.
If you go in as a fringe, someone that has not done that much wrong, you might have committed one mistake, and you get a sentence, you will definitely come out, and you're not ready to deal with that. You ain't tough. You'll come out broken, in my opinion. And I saw a lot of people broken.
Norman Stanley Fletcher.
I kind of was born into what they'd call a dysfunctional family. My family was known to social care from the day I was born. My own mother came through the care system herself, so she didn't have the best parenting skills or the support available for her, and she was also a single parent. Because of the lack of parenting at home and also the lack of stability, I started to get in trouble at quite a young age, and that involved me getting involved within the criminal justice system. The police became quite frequent around my house. I used to run away as a child, started shoplifting, and I ended up getting my first appearance at court at the age of 11. But I also got my first custodial sentence at the age of 14. I was in children's homes for quite a number of years, and I also got involved more within the criminal justice system.
Kids do things, that are silly and a bit adventurous and spontaneous, and in that kind of environment it's likely to be criminal. If I'd grown up in a rough estate, if I'd had a dysfunctional family, if I hadn't been made to go to school, because a lot of kids don't really like to go to school, you need a parental push sometimes, but if my parents didn't give a damn, get into drugs or gangs or such like, crime is just the kind of a natural follow-on from that.
Tough upbringing, brutal upbringing, a lot of violence, a lot of told I wasn't good enough, a lot of regret for what I was good at, I grew up in a rough estate, grew up with a very violent upbringing. I was also captain of the rugby team, captain of the cricket team. I got a scholarship to a private school. I had the ability to do what I wanted. I got 7 A's in GCSEs, 2 A stars. I could have done whatever I wanted, and I fucked it up.
You can't sort of blame people just and say, well, it's all their fault, because we're a product of where we've been and where we've come from. And if you're in that kind of environment, then that is how you'll be.
9 years old, I was robbing the bus as a 9. We used to get on the bus. One person used to sit at the front next to the driver. 4 of us used to go to the back, take it in turns, always on a late Friday night. four of you used to get out of the back, open the emergency exit, call the driver a wanker, etc. And then the driver got out, you pinched the cash box, and that was your hash for the weekend. That's how it all started. By 11, I was selling weed. By 13, robbing people. 15, robbing dealers at a high level. 16, cash point robberies, knife point and stuff. And that's what I eventually went down for at 17, the first time I robbed a police officer at cash point with a knife. I was swiftly arrested for that. And that's what I got. I got first sentence of 12 do 6.
In secure units at 15, and whilst everybody else was doing their education and finishing off their qualifications, I was doing 6 months in a young offenders institution.
If you're not educated, you don't learn to make good decisions. You don't think things through. And that's one of the things that education gives you.
I didn't have any real belief in myself. I thought I was a non-achiever. I thought it was a waste of space. People told me that I'd end up spend the rest of my life in prison on drugs, and so on and so forth. And that led me to getting a 3-year prison sentence when I was 20 years of age. And it was at that point that my whole life took a whole different journey. During that sentence, I was introduced to heroin, and then that led me to spending nearly 15 years of my life trapped with heroin dependency. And that dependency took me down a really, really dark path. I experienced stuff that I never ever thought I'd do. I ended up being an intravenous user. I spent life in homeless hostels. I spent time on the streets. I begged, I stole, I robbed, I did whatever it was I could to get that fix. And I also spent quite a few more years in prison.
A person who is homeless, somebody from a marginalised grouping, somebody who is seen on the outside of society, if they break the law, if they do something that is wrong, they are much more likely than somebody from a middle class background to become incorporated within the actual criminal process itself. We're talking about hurting people who have actually come from social backgrounds where they've often been damaged. A large number of people in prison have been grown up in care.
It is very much people who are the most vulnerable within our communities. We're talking about people with long-term mental health issues. We're talking about people with drug and alcohol substance misuse issues. It's vulnerable groups that we've got in prison. And I remember when I was younger, and if we go back to Porridge again, they kind of talked about Porridge, him being a career criminal. There's very few that are real career criminals, people that make a real good living out of it. Most of the people that are in prisons live below the poverty line and have come from really, really dysfunctional backgrounds and some of the most deprived areas of the city. So what we actually do, what our system does, is we punish them for being poor.
When a crime goes unpunished, that is a breach of the victim's liberty and human rights. When you have organised crime gangs free to practice their evil, countless young people have their liberty, often their lives, damaged. And when antisocial behaviour goes unchecked, each and every member of the community in which it happens has their human rights broken.
Blair's government created 3,500 new offences. And who do these offences affect, and who is going to prison? Working class people. So you got kind of two options. You either believe that the working class are inherently criminal, or you believe that the actions that they take as a kind of response to neoliberalism, the things that they have to do in order to survive, have been criminalised.
The criminal law has never been envisaged to actually regulate the rich. The criminal law has always, since its inception, going back centuries, been there to regulate those at the bottom of society. The criminal law is about regulating poverty, and it's about ultimately soaking up and actually taking a group of people and saying, look, we don't know what to do with you anymore. You've got a lot of problems, a lot of difficulties. Society has failed you on all sorts of levels. We don't know what to do apart from to put an institution which is basically going to warehouse you, which is going to keep you there for a certain period of time. And then we'll let you out. And of course, you're going to be in an even worse state of repair, probably.
If someone steals something because they have some food, because they haven't got enough to eat, they're labelled a criminal and they can have a prison sentence. If the banks defraud you and bring down the economic system, you don't do anything to them. Tony Blair, war criminal, still walking around, still pronouncing on, the political situation in this country. Responsible for the deaths of 1 million people who would still be alive to this day if it wasn't for Blair. But he's not in prison.
There's a certain amount of immunity for the powerful in terms of the criminal law. One of the reasons why we don't have such an emphasis on the control and regulation of the harms of the powerful and corporations and business is because it's so much more complicated, and because often legal activities are interspersed with illegalities. So you have to have corporations, even at the very top, who are very much on a front of actually doing legal business, but underneath that can also be involved in quite a lot of criminal activity.
If you think about it, usually what is defined as a crime is a kind of one-on-one crime, so, a robbery or an assault. And I think it's Danny Dorlin that said, if you think about it not in terms of crime, but in terms of harm, and who does the most harm, then it's the big corporations.
One of the reasons why I have such a problem with the notion of criminalisation itself is that it is orientated around harm and blame. And that ultimate notion of trying to deal with human problems, human conflicts, human difficulties through this lens of blame and harm results almost automatically in the adoption of punishment as the solution.
There was people with their dogs and their kids coming down to have a look. There was older people, younger people. Everyone was chatting to everyone and sort of talking about what was going on.
But there is a continued heavy police presence, as Martin was saying, on the streets. But it's led to another night of relative calm, no violent outbreaks. The questions are still being asked about what motivated thousands to take part in those acts of looting, arson and vandalism earlier in the week. Tom Parmenter has been speaking to some gang members who were involved in looting across South London. They appear to show no remorse, saying they had no choice as society had let them down.
If you look at after the 2011 riots, there was a spike in the amount of people going to prison, and people were getting long sentences. People who had never been in trouble before were getting long sentences for stealing bottles of water. And the prison and the courts were open for 24 hours. They were just shifting these people through. And the first thing that Cameron came out and said was, this is criminality pure and simple. And there's nothing pure and there's nothing simple about what was going on there. And there's nothing pure and nothing simple about the way that working classes are being treated under neoliberalism. But if you construct them as criminals, and if you construct their responses to that neoliberalism as criminal behaviour, then you justify warehousing them. And that's exactly what's happening.
In my opinion, our feral underclass in this country is too big, has been growing, and now needs to be diminished.
So I sat as a magistrate for 3 years, probably stopped 10 years ago. And, I wanted to do it in that kind of, way of wanting to make a positive difference. But looking back on the experience, what is terrifying is how little I knew. I knew nothing about why people commit crime, how to reduce crime, or anything really about the sentencing that I was part of meting out. And I don't think I did much harm, to be honest. I mean, I've always been quite felt that prison should be a last resort. But should people who know so little be in those positions of responsibility? And I wouldn't also say that paid judges know enough either.
It's a game. So obviously the prosecutor has a career. He needs to find a conviction. The prosecution like to supplement with a circumstantial story narratives, but also prejudicial pieces of evidence like the gang. So they say, oh, well, they must be part of a gang. They are part of a gang. Look, they appeared in this YouTube rap video together, or look at this old picture when they were 16 wearing gang emblems and doing things with their hands. And they kind of use that word because it draws upon the innate prejudices of the jury. And then the jury start to construct this own story within their heads about, oh, well, if they're a gang, then definitely. Gangs are born of violence, aren't they, really?
There's a lot of complacency about our justice system, but in fact we have a very flawed one where it's easy to get convicted even if perhaps you're not guilty. People are put under pressure to plead guilty, and then they get very hefty punishments which they wouldn't get in other countries.
I am the sister of Alex Henry. He was convicted in 2014 for murder under joint enterprise. This situation is when me and you commit one crime A, so that could be a spontaneous fight outside a pub, and during the course of that fight you go on to commit a further crime B. So if you were to bottle someone or punch someone extra hard outside that pub and that person were to die, you would be convicted of murder, but also I would be convicted of that crime B, of that murder, so long as I foresaw the possibility that it may happen. In my brother's particular case, it was a Tuesday afternoon in 2013, and he was out shopping with 3 friends. He came out of a shop with one friend to see another friend being circled by a group of 4 older men. When one of the older boys lunges towards his friend, Alex throws a mobile phone at him and punches begin to fly. Alex punched one boy and obviously threw the phone. Those boys punched Janelle, so there was violence on both sides of this fight. The fight lasted 47 seconds, and during that time frame the boy Alex ran out of the shop with put his hand inside his JD sports bag and held a knife. He didn't take the knife out of the bag, and it was concealed throughout the entire affray, and he used that knife to stab 2 people. My brother fled the scene within seconds afterwards, not knowing that a knife had been used. He was actually pursued by the victims because they didn't realise that they had been stabbed either, so they were actually chasing him away to reinstigate more violence. One of them pauses kind of mid-run and becomes obviously unwell and dies very quickly after that. All 4, Alex, Janelle, Eunice and Cameron being the person who used the knife, were charged with murder. There was no evidence to prove that he knew a knife was there or that he could then foresee that a knife would be used. And those were the 2 things that the jury had to find beyond all reasonable doubt. The prosecution said that friends tell each other everything. So if friends tell each other everything, then my brother would have known a knife was present during the course of that shopping trip and then could foresee the possibility that that knife might be used. We had been told, somehow someone found out, that it was stuck on a 9 to 3. And we were like, oh my God, 3 people think he's guilty. That's shocking. How can 3 people think beyond all reasonable doubt he's guilty because friends tell each other everything? And they came in and then they said, oh, Janelle, Grant Murray, please stand. Foreman of the jury, how do you find him? And he said, guilty. And my mum she was next to me and she couldn't hear. So she went almost deaf and she was just pulling at me going, what did they say? Is that Alex? Is that Alex? Did they say that that's Alex? And then I was like, no, Mum, that wasn't Alex. That was Janelle. And I'm just looking over at Janelle's mum who's crying. And then it was Eunice Taib, can you stand? How do you find Eunice? And it was Innocent and my mum, who's now on the floor kind of pulling at me going, was that Alex? Was that Alex? And I was like, no, Mum, that's not Alex. And then they said, Alex. And said guilty. Mum's just screaming. But, so yeah, I gave it a massive shock. So,
unfortunately for those who are innocent, talk about punishment, it's 10 leagues beyond anybody else, because within prison they can't do any of the systems, so they often kind of actually stay in longer than somebody who says they're guilty and goes through the programs.
When my mum and dad was at the court when I got sentenced, and after the judges went back and then came out, they said, look, give you 12d6. Remember the first thing I did, I turned around, mum was crying, looked at my dad and he just goes, fucking stay strong. That's it. And as I went down, they led you down into the temporary cells underneath the court before you get picked up, and there's got a little mirror in there. I remember looking at myself in the mirror and went, fucking be strong. Like, obviously nervous inside, but it ain't in my nature to fight or flight. I'll fight.
If you've ever been in a prison, it's quite obvious it doesn't work. They're really brutal, vile systems. This idea that prison is some kind of holiday camp is absolutely absurd.
And for someone who generally has lived a lovely life and has been caring, taking his next door neighbours, been out, and they come into jail too. They don't comprehend how this has happened or why it's happened. And again, there's a lot of caring again there to help them understand mentally what's happened and what is happening and what's going to happen after this period of time they've spent with their sentence and with us in jail.
When I first got my first custodial sentence, and I can still remember the number for that, it was M33681. Okay, that's what I was labelled. I was M33681 Jones, sir. And detention centre was what they called short, sharp shock, and it was a product from the late 60s and 70s. And literally, it was just a place that was bred on fear and intimidation and the threat of violence. And what they did is they tried to scare people out of crime. But for me, it did the opposite.
So I went in there, actually too rowdy. Like you they pretty much, when you get there, they give you a little talk at the beginning. Like you've got a counsellor there and the governor or one of the head screws give you a little talk. They said, look, top advice, look after yourself, but don't, keep yourself to yourself if possible. I went in there too strong, too brash. I'm naturally a leader, and naturally I can't take a back step. So I went in there a bit heavy, to be honest. But nothing happened for 2 weeks. Everyone allowed me, and then it was like a couple of weeks into I was playing football in the gym. First test, which everyone gets. He's come out, tripped me from behind. My head literally just went, right, this is the moment. Like, you either know in yourself, I'm either going to bottle it here, I'm going to be a victim, or I'm going to step up and no one's going to give me any shit. Went over and I grabbed him by the neck and said, what if I could do? And he spat in my face. And that was the point that I actually got in trouble for, because I didn't react to that. Like, it was such a shock. I went, what the fuck is it? Spitting in the face is stronger. I've been beaten up 100 times, but spitting in your face is too heavy. And it sort of threw me back. So I did nothing, went to the showers, went to get changed in the showers where everything happens, purely for the reason that there's no one, can't be watched there in the screws. Went in there, fella walked in, invited his friends, started laying into me. I knocked a couple of them out, did a decent job, and as soon as after that I stood up, after getting up, a bit battered and bruised, come past my cell the next day, shook my hand, and they said, look, fair enough, like, it's cool. I said, I apologise. They said, no, it's alright, you heard your grand, you did your bit. And it was alright. So after that, and from then on, I fucking loved it. I had no trouble whatsoever. I had a fucking good time. Like, excuse the fact there was horrible food and no women. Like, I can't speak highly enough about what it done for my self-esteem anyway.
I came out with an attitude of, what, is that all you've got? Is that your lot? Because I don't care. If that's it, I don't care.
It sort of benefits people who are tough, and it cripples people that are weak.
The whole system ends up punishing the family in all kinds of ways. They're financially punished, they're punished in terms of the stigma. So there's a kind of like the idea that if that person committed crime, they're bad, they're probably part of a bad family. So the stigma spreads as well. And in the end, I hate to say it, but a lot of families fracture because the stress is so great and the difficulties of visiting people in prison is very great as well.
No one prepares you for that. No one prepares you. One day he's with you, and then I find out he has been kept in custody, and then after that been sentenced and go to prison. It was horrible, devastating news. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how he's going to react. Should I contact him? Should I not? I wasn't upset with him whatsoever. I was just worried. So I wrote him a note. I love him. I decided to stand by him. And after that, he responded with a letter. It was nerve-wracking. And I went for my very first visit. Then I saw him. And my heart was absolutely, I just want to take him home. It was really, really hard to see him like that. And the first conversation we had, he said to me, I'm so sorry. I said, don't worry, I told you in a note, I will stay with you. I love you so much. And he said to me, I don't expect you to stay with me. I worked 14 hours a day, hardly have any sleep, anything to eat, because what I want to do, I still got a little bit of time to build something outside to come back to. I know we've got each other, but obviously it's not enough. We need to have a place to be. I've got a job, so it's okay. But it's hard to live on a minimum wage. There was a post on one of the social medias, because back then I was living on a boat, my boat going to be torched. I had to pack my stuff in a couple of hours, and I went to live somewhere else, 300 miles away from there. That was our friends who started the hate campaign. They post article from a newspaper on Facebook, and that's how it started.
I mean, what we experienced was, the typical UK public reaction to somebody who ends up in prison. It didn't make sense. Nobody really knew what they were talking about. They just made assumptions. This person's in prison, they're all murderers, aren't they? Well, no, they're not.
Inmates at a prison in the British town of Bedford have gone on a rampage. According to officials, 2 wings of the prison were overrun.
Police have regained control of one of Britain's biggest jails hours after a huge riot broke out. Up to 600 inmates took over 4 wings of the privately run prison in Birmingham.
I think that where people have committed very serious offences, there is an expectation from society that there will be some form of punishment. Now, the glib answer is that the loss of your freedom is the punishment, and you don't have to then enhance that punishment by making sure that people live in, dirty or very sort of squalid conditions or overcrowded conditions. And I agree with that. I think that, if the state are taking someone's liberty away from them as the punishment, which I think is quite appropriate, then the state has a responsibility to ensure that their well-being is maintained.
There's always frustrations in jail. Like people say it's an easy ride, but it isn't. Being locked up and controlled 24 hours a day and not having any freedom is very difficult.
I think prisons are places of institutionally structured violence. And what I mean by that is that I think that the very structure and organisation of the prison is one which is predicated upon the deprivation of need. But the very architecture, the very daily regime of the prison is one which is deliberately intended to deprive people of various different basic human needs.
It's the hard bit is you're completely taken away from your family. Like you got shit, menial things like you got crap food, etc., etc. You got no liberties. But it's not having your family there, not having your freedom. When you're thirsty, you can't drink out of tap because there's non-drinkable water. Little things like that. If you want to shave, you have to wait till the morning. Then they give you a razor, and then you have to sign for the razor. Little things like that. They're the bits that really niggle at you. Like, and the reason you've got a TV, the reason you've got a thing, is to keep everyone calm.
People are banged up for hours and hours on end. Sometimes 22, 23 hours a day.
Prison time is long, and it's boring, and it's empty, and it's that lack of meaning, irrespective of the kind of conditions that you're in, the lack of meaning that prison automatically generates, the focus on the past, the sense of a present which is continuing forever, the sense of ended futures that can no longer be gone back to and no longer achieved. These things lead to what's known as a saturation of time consciousness.
I think the reasons that there's more violence now is they're so bored. What else can they do?
People may kill themselves, they may take drugs, they may engage in other forms of behaviour, ultimately leading to riots. And again, successive ministers will say, well, are you justifying that? Well, of course you're not justifying it, but you're contextualising it and attempting to understand why. The question really is, why would individuals who know they might get an extra 10 years on top of their sentences, why would they engage in riotous behaviour unless they feel that the system has badly let them down?
It's got like a point system basically, right? You start on at 10 points, right? If you behave well, you go up and you get TV, you get a radio, then you get TV, then you get a PlayStation. If you do bad, you lose time on your social, like your break time. You lose TV privilege, radio privileges, and the thing is with it, the bullied kids, like no one snitches on anyone, standard basically. So if there's a fight, two of you come out of a fight, they catch you fighting. No one's going to say he beat me up, right? So they have to punish both equally. So both the bullies and the bullied had nothing.
You get either the problem with prisons in terms of relationships, of people being deprived of relationships in terms of intimate relationships with friends and families, or you get the other opposite, which you get this notion of forced relationality. You get this sense where people are forced into relationships. And I suppose a prison is a little bit like a bathroom in terms of a prison cell, because when you think about what a bathroom is, it has a toilet, it has the bath obviously, and it's a very small little kind of place where people go into. Now if you take out that bath and you put in a bunk bed and you kind of then put yourself in that with an inspection hole in the door, and you lock yourself up for potentially up to 23 hours a day within that very, very small confined space, and then you spend that time with a person who you least want to spend time with, then you kind of get some idea what we mean by forced relationality.
Like the people with the most stuff in there are the ones who are the top, like they're the alphas. And the problem is that the weak get weaker and weaker and weaker, and that's where the suicide comes into it. And I was in Onley, which is, quite high suicide rates in there, and they're brutal in there. There's no, if you come out of a fight, they'll just be like, look, don't know who did it, okay, well, you're both punished then. And so the bully kids, like who a lot of them weak, had health issues, they needed coddling. And there was none of that for them.
Because of the pains and deprivations of prison, they're actually something which is going to create that sense of victimhood within the offender themselves, and they're going to be less likely to look at what they did in terms of taking responsibility for that. They're going to say, well, you've just harmed me, and I think that actually now I'm going to be less willing to engage with what I've done that's wrong, and it can lead to things like condemning of the condemners.
There's violence, there's drugs, There's kind of hierarchies of prisoners. There's bullying.
Now, it's particularly difficult for young children, and that's why we've had, in the past, very high numbers of child deaths in prisons, and in particular cluster deaths. This is because children just don't know if things are going to get better. They haven't got the life resources, they haven't got the life skills to know that life can go up and life can go down, and that things can get better as well as getting worse. And so when they're in a situation where they're kind of deprived of that kind of maternal support and attachment with friends and family, when they're in a situation where life is very bleak, because life is almost inevitably going to be very bleak in an institution which is designed to deliberately inflict pain. They don't know things are going to get better. If they're physically harmed or being bullied, if they're they just don't necessarily think that life is going to get any better for them. And so we have this terrible notion of suicidal ideation actually impacting upon a large number of children.
A young offenders institution is just basically prison for under 21s. In the Feltham, like, you'll be on a visit and you'll see someone being beaten up in front of their screaming families and the guards do nothing. I feel like the guards actually enjoy it. There's a real kind of divide there. They don't see the children like children, they see them like animals.
Prisons are often places of abandonment. They're often places where people are put into because they're unwanted people that nobody else wants to deal with. So we have that sense of we have these abandoned people who probably are going to cope with a lot of the aspects of prison very poorly anyway. But you place even somebody who's had a perfect life before they come into prison, and you place them within that loss of meaning, and they're going to really, really struggle, because prison itself is an institution which is always likely to create major problems for human beings.
A couple of kids I was in there from that weren't from that life, they're from nicer areas, decent upbringing, and then they made one mistake, some of them bad mistakes. I was in there with a kid that it was like, I think he went to not Eton, but maybe Windsor or something like that. Went mad, did too much gear, ended up stabbing someone, like paranoia after being bullied. He went inside, got 6 years, and he just, by the end of it, he was just broken. He tried committing suicide twice. I saw he tried committing suicide 3 times. The first time, you couldn't hang yourself. He tied a rope around his, like the blanket you get, sort of, you can pull off the string, tied the string around his neck and tied it to the windowsill, and then tried running forward as fast as he can. All that happened is he badly sprained his neck. Right, and then after he got out, he went to and then everyone starts taking the piss out of him. Right, as brutal as people are. And then he got out. He tried setting himself on fire, but for some reason he took all his clothes off and set fire to his pants. And all he did is basically burn his cock. Right, then got mocked. Right, and all this time he's getting mocked. He's probably thinking to himself, "Fucking, I can't even kill myself properly." Like, and it's sort of I'm laughing at it, but it ain't funny. It's just and then what's the third one he did? I can't remember what he did, sorry. But yeah, I mean, he come out broken. And the thing is, forget about the broken thing, him personally, I imagine that from where he's from, he's probably been ostracised by his middle to upper class friends, he's the crazy kid that stabbed somebody. Forget about the fact he's lost any opportunity of getting the sort of jobs his parents maybe would have wanted him to get. That's a punishment that he's never going to get over. So it doesn't matter if he serves his time that you're dedicated from the courts, he's never going to get over that. He's never going to get over the mental torment. His parents are going to still be maybe sort of pushed out from their cliquey, posh group. So, and they're going to probably take out on him. And you get that quite a lot, and he'll be ruined for good. So that definitely wouldn't have benefited him.
In 2016, there were 119 recorded self-inflicted deaths in prison. Now that figure is actually still likely to go up, because there's still more than 20 of the 345 deaths which haven't been classified. Now, that means that somebody has taken their own life in prison about once every 3 days. It also means that a person is dying in prison nearly every day in England and Wales. I was able to estimate that somewhere in the region of every 4 to 5 hours, a prisoner attempts to take their own life. We also know that rates of self-harm are extraordinarily high. And again, just in recent weeks, we've seen further figures released indicating this is now probably at record levels of self-harm in the prison system that we've ever seen.
Of course, many of the prisons that we have contain people who should not be in prison. They're not bad people. They are not violent or dangerous people. The public do not need to be protected from them in the sense that the public are at risk or at harm.
I've seen people in prison who definitely had serious mental health problems and they shouldn't have been in prison. They needed monocotony. But me personally, I didn't need that. I needed to just, fucking, you're a dickhead, clip my ear roll, toughen up, and deal with it yourself. No one's going to look after you look after yourself.
These people are in dire need of some kind of therapeutic help. They're in dire need of being nurtured and cared for, not labelled criminal and then brutalised even more.
You've got your sort of standard things there where they, like you've got a nurse you can speak to or a psychologist you can speak to, but ain't give a shit, basically. From my experience, that doesn't mean that applies to all, but yeah, I mean, you can, can you go and can I speak to a psychologist, please? And they just got a checklist of, are you feeling anxious? Yes, okay, yes, they give you some pills, get back on with it.
I recall a mental health issue with a young man once. A very nice young man. His room and the way he lived was immaculate. His cell was immaculate. But he was constantly worried that he was going to end in a similar way to his family, where his brother, mother and father had all committed suicide. They were all drinkers. And he couldn't handle the whole situation of his whole family committing suicide. And he knew this, and he explained that to you. And he said he couldn't understand this, and he wanted help, and he needed help. This young man had previously cut a finger off on his hand, and then he'd again cut a second finger off, so he'd managed to cut these fingers off. And he'd done this by smashing open a razor blade, getting the razor blade and just literally sawing away at it. And he'd be standing over his sink because, bless him, didn't want to get anywhere in his cell dirt. It was immaculate. He didn't want to get blood on. He used to immediately say it on any member of staff. He was very, very upset and embarrassed about what he'd done. But he'd be standing there with another finger cut off at the knuckle in his hand, dripping in the sink, saying, "I'm really sorry. I apologise. I'm really sorry, but I've done it again." He'll directly tell you, "I need help, I need to see someone." He was referred again and again to the mental health team, who eventually came over and assessed him and came out and said there was nothing wrong. And systematically he cut another finger off and a further finger off, and after a numerous amounts of times of visits to hospital where they tried to sew his fingers back on, the surgeon got to the point where he had to explain to the prisoner that I'm not going to sew it on anymore.
Self-harm may be a way of turning mental pain into physical pain. The mental pain, the frustrations of prisons, the kind of the sense of waste, the lack of meaning, this erasure of any sense of hope for the future. This is, of course, going to be profoundly difficult to deal with. It's going to be an intense form of pain and suffering. Some people will cut themselves or will insert objects into their bodies as a way of actually trying to cope.
Maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe that's an issue, I suppose. Like, you can't do it the same way maybe in a school, state school you've got 30 kids in a class, in private school you've got 8 kids in a class, so you can't appeal to each one. There's too many. Prison systems overwhelmed, I suppose.
Due to shortage of staff and the number of prisoners you have in ratio of staff, so the nurses have got to get around sometimes 500,000 prisoners.
When a prisoner, when a lag wipes his own excrement on a wall in his cell, they now clean it off with Prosecco. And this is in some of the high. This is happening at Dartmoor.
Right.
and Exeter.
I can believe it.
No wonder people have such a low opinion of those with a criminal record because of the media. They're not looking at the causes, they're not looking at the reasons why they're reacting in this way. And if they looked at some of that, maybe they would understand.
What I don't understand is you get to meet a lot of people who have no idea of prison, and they say, you get to them like, oh, prison's a summer camp, you know, it's easy. Why have they got a PlayStation? Why have they got a TV? And like that's always annoyed me.
People start to think, oh, that prisons are holiday camps. Really? Well, I don't want to stay in one.
All they've got to go on is media reports. You've been told as you were a child that somebody who's bad goes to prison. That's how you're punished. That's what it's for.
And it has such an impact. And that then perhaps becomes more of their stereotypical view of what prisoners are.
And what it also does is it sets up this symbolic idea that those people in prison are immensely problematic, and we, on the outside, are law-abiding, good individuals who have never broken the law in our lives.
So Transform Justice has done a big project on communication about criminal justice. And what we found out through research is that most people believe that those who commit crime have made a rational, logical choice to do so, having looked at the benefits of doing the crime, the gain as it were, but also the chances of being caught and what the punishment is. And that people, as it were, sit back and say, yes, it's worth it, the scales are right, I will commit that crime. So because people think it was a choice that an individual made, then they think all consequences that flow from that are fair enough.
You know, you hear the same old stuff all the time. And when I was a governor, I used to go out and talk to various groups of people. I used to take a prisoner with me. And sometimes it'd be a life sentence prisoner, sometimes it'd be a man serving a long determinate sentence. And I wouldn't sort of introduce them as a prisoner, so we'd just both turn up at the venue. We'd do a joint presentation of the prison. The stereotypical view that they held of a prisoner wasn't what they were seeing, someone they were just chatting with, and it just changed their view. When you actually meet somebody and they're very different to the stereotypical view that you've had, you make your own judgment, and it's real.
I can give you an example of it. I was in the Verne prison, I was 21 years of age, and I was sat in a room, and it was me and 3 other young men, all of us between the ages of 21 and 23, and we were playing backgammon, having a real laugh and a giggle, talking about girls' life, and all the sort of normal stuff. If you looked at us on paper, okay, I was in there for conspiracy to supply Class A controlled drugs. Another one was in there for supplying Class A controlled drugs. The other one was in there for armed robbery, and the other one was doing Her Majesty's pleasure for murder. Okay, but none of us were bad. Yeah, we were just young people that had had certain situations in our life that had led us to that point. But if anybody at all had looked at the files, we'd have been written off.
The effect on society, I just think that that's just not the way people think, They think, in reality, I'm afraid, that if you've made a choice that way, you should be severely punished, and the easiest way of doing that is to lock people up in prison.
We are spending between £40,000 and £80,000 a year, depending on the category of prisoner which is being held in the kind of institution, to actually keep those people there. It's a total, in terms of a rational answer, it actually just doesn't work. Prisons do not actually work on these basic principles of deterrence, rehabilitation and incapacitation at all.
Just because I've killed, does that make me a murderer?
So for about 5 years I taught in a prison, taught in the education department, and I got permission from the prison governor to run filmmaking courses as a kind of extracurricular course. And the prisoners did everything. They scripted them, they cast them, they did the research, they filmed them, they edited them, and the prison let us put on a little film festival at the end. So each one of them was about what it was like to be oppressed.
Say, I am what I am
Who am I?
What it was like to, what is justice? I mean, it was really, really interesting. And that, I think, is the kind of thinking behind the Inside Film Project, that when working class people can tell their own stories, they're very different and they're much more complex to the representations you get of working class people by middle class people who have no idea about working class life whatsoever. One of them was about drug dealing and about violence, about living on the streets of London in gangs, and the Rochester asked us not to show it. We haven't been able to get into a prison since then.
When you've got the poor and the powerless constructed as people who are bodies without brains, when you've got these TV shows which are constructing them as basically individuals who lack intelligence, when you've got a whole system which is geared towards the punishment of the poor and the powerless, where the rich and powerful simply walk away from it, and let's be honest, that's what we've got in the 21st century now, then you need to look at this system in its broadest sense and say, what are we doing ultimately at the end of the day? Since the end of the 18th century, when prisons first emerged, they've always been about the delivery of punishment and pain with regard to those people who are in there. So in other words, rehabilitation in many respects has been a myth, because it's always been undermined by the drive of the prison system to discipline and punish those who have been incarcerated within them.
So prisons in their history, certainly as reform prisons going back to the 1770s, have never been successful at actually generating this notion of a penitent, of this idea of the early penitentiaries, which were there to make people repent and to go back and create a new life.
By the 1830s, it was already been severely criticised for its failures in many respects. And so those criticisms have continued for the last 200 years.
Now, what prisons have been very good at, they've been very good at crushing individuals. But what they've never been able to do is actually, with only a very, very small number of exceptions, has been to actually generate that new life, that new law-abiding idea. The prisons as a place of rehabilitation are an absolute total failure, and we cannot defend them on those grounds morally.
I always made sure that I spent more time with prisoners than I did with members of staff. I saw so many wasted lives. I saw so many people that were completely bored, and these so-called jobs within the prison don't really exist. I mean, you can't say that emptying waste paper baskets is a job, and it's certainly not going to help you on release.
There's definitely rehabilitation there. It's not done correctly. It's not done in a structured form which is beneficial or to the prisoner himself.
I've witnessed you pushing your way in front of the queue for gym, being impulsive, and you're putting people in feelings, and what I mean by that is, me personally, it makes me angry. You know, if I've waited my turn to queue up for the gym and then you go and push in, you make me angry, mate. It's put me in a high risk situation.
There was an anger management class I went to and a drug rehabilitation class I went to, and they didn't stop me doing drugs, they didn't stop me being angry, but it was nice to know that there was people that were also had the same issues as you. Because when you're a teenager, you think you're the only one with this problem, you know, you're the only one that's angry, you're the world's against me. If you forget the emotional side of it, giving people a chance to go and do classes in prison, like to watch TV, to do it, that just keeps you calm, which means you need less screws, you need less gunmen, which is just monetary. Well, it's a good thing that you've got that, because otherwise it will kick off.
I'm not naive. I mean, I've met many prisoners that have had horrendous backgrounds, and many were victims themselves. So help is needed for them to get themselves back to a position where, once they're on release, they can actually do some good in society.
The prison system is creating a situation which is making it harder for that person to reintegrate and have a law-abiding society.
When it started to get closer to the release date, you'd have a feeling of fear and excitement. So you'd be excited to get out because it's something different, but you'd be really fearful about, but what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Because you absolutely knew that you've had all of this history before where nothing had changed. But what you'd always say to people, I ain't coming back this time, I ain't coming back. But inside you kind of knew you know.
The prison removes social bonds. The prison removes connections with families and so on and so forth, which means that when a person is released, they're not going to have necessarily a place to stop. Because of the very restrictive amount of financial support that prisoners get, they're not going to have a lot of money to re-establish a life.
I'd get given my discharge grant, which is probably about 46 quid, and they'd give me the travel warrant. I'd come out the gate. They'd usually take you in a minibus down to the local train station.
Because of the stigmata of the criminal label and being an ex-prisoner, it means they're going to find it even more difficult to actually get a job.
You've got to go to your probation officer on day one. They may have found you some accommodation. They may not have. The 46 quid would usually be a week's dole money, but in real terms it would probably take at least 5 to 6 weeks before your dole money came through. You couldn't get your housing benefit until that came through, so yeah, it was all a bit...
It is a life sentence, isn't it? Whether you have done murder or not, the consequences are so great. I mean, obviously some people are able to move on and that's fantastic, but the difficulties in doing so, the barriers are huge.
They're always going to have that, almost like a mark on their forehead. You know, they're never going to do anything with their lives, you know, so why should we bother?
So everything that we know that works in terms of helping people to be law-abiding citizens is actually removed by the prison. We take away people's connections to their families. We take away people's attachments. We take away people's ability to work. We take away their homes. And ultimately, once we've placed them in an institution which has largely degraded them, has largely left them in a situation which they are more alienated from society, we then throw them back out onto the streets and expect them somehow to be able to rebuild a life.
And then what you do is you just bumble yourself around until before you know it, you're sort of like into the swing of the criminal life.
Reoffending rates have been largely consistent over the last 150 years, and that certainly for younger people you have a situation of around about 75% of young people reoffend within 1 year. And as you go on over longer periods, so you look at this over say a 5-year period, you find that reoffending rates go even higher than this. And the same is for adults. And again, almost consistently the same statistic has come back over the last few decades, which is around 50% of adults will reoffend within 1 year. And again, as you then look forward on that in terms of time, you find that number increases. And of course, we have to be aware of the recidivism data is always going to be an underestimate, because it's only the people who've actually been caught. So when we actually look at this recidivism data, and when we're saying 50% of people will reoffend or 75% of people will reoffend, then actually we know that it's more than that. We know that prison is actually a place which is a school for crime. It's a place of actually generating not just the difficulties of reintegrating or re-entry into society, but it's also a way for people to talk to others and to learn new skills, actually in criminal activity.
People who go to prison and who are sent to prison, the vast majority of those individuals will come back out.
You know, that shouldn't surprise people, because they are, you know, daughters, sons, mothers, fathers, grandfathers anyway. You know, they've been in the community. They're going to return to the community.
Now, what do we want these people to be when they come back out?
Welcome to the Norwegian prison system, based on the principle of rehabilitation, not revenge.
I want to meet prisoners.
Yeah, you want to meet prisoners?
Yeah.
You're meeting one now.
You're a prisoner dressed like this?
Yes.
If one looks at the Scandinavian prison system and societies which are much more socially integrated and inclusive, I'm not idealising them because they've got their own problems as well, many less people go to prisons in Scandinavia, sentences are much shorter. Has that led to a huge increase in the crime rate? No, actually, at the end of the day. In America, you can go to states in America which have capital punishment, and they've got the highest rates of murder. So this idea that you can correlate intense levels of punishment with a reduction in crime is just nonsense.
So when it comes to people saying, well, this will send a deterrent message to people, well, we actually can't measure that. And also, you have to have some sense of attachment and some sense of connection to society for you to actually have that kind of sense of deterrence in the first instance. So what may deter some people who have a decent job and who have a home and who have children and so on and so forth isn't necessarily going to deter somebody who's on the street, isn't going to deter somebody who's homeless, isn't going to deter somebody who's actually not got a lot in society. Because if you ain't got nothing, you ain't got nothing to lose.
For me, there was colleges and universities so close by. Why wasn't there stronger links? Why wasn't the companies in the locality training up prisoners so on release there was a possibility that they could have a job, but at least training them in something that would actually give them a job later on? But that wasn't happening.
And I think one of the really saddest things of the whole thing is that certainly the times I've been inside, I've interviewed staff who have broken down on tape when they've been interviewed, not because of the prisoners, but actually because of the occupational culture they've experienced inside. They're pejoratively known as care bears. It's a pejorative label because they cared about the prisoners. But many of them talked about leaving the prison service because they couldn't handle the stresses and strains and the impact of that kind of negative stereotyping and that negative labelling.
They made a lot of redundancies as well, and again it was just a money making or money saving process by the government, and as that happened the levels of staffing got to a dangerous level, and as it did we did sort of warn them and saying it wouldn't work and there's not enough officers there to support each other and make the system work, which no one heeded. And hence we got to the point where we're at now, I think.
I was president of the Prison Governors Association for nearly 5 years, and I used to say to sort of colleagues, other trade union leaders, that we're probably one of the few unions that are campaigning for fewer members at the end of the day, because we would advocate, we should close prisons, we should have a much smaller population. And I think that, that was what people believed, and rightly so. And I think that comes back to the point that people join the prison service because it's more vocational than a job. They want to do something which is good. They want to make a positive impact. And the best way of doing that is to reduce the size of the prison population,
The smaller jails seem to be, like I said, a bit more personable and more sort of structured to deal with individuals and their issues.
The inspectorate, prison inspectorate, have said on numerous occasions that the outcomes for prisoners in smaller prisons are better than outcomes for prisoners in larger prisons.
You can't just put thousands of people in one big prison and expect, to come out the other end reformed and, got their lives all sorted out.
So the attraction to build big and gain the economies of scale from a taxpayer's point of view is great. But when you factor in the cost of the reoffending, because those people who come out are not going to be as successful at resettling without reoffending in the community, then I suspect that if we invested in smaller prisons and higher staff ratios to get a situation where staff have time to deal with prisoners and they're much smaller units, if we invested in that, the long-term savings would be enormous.
Now, we're in a bit of a kind of a contradictory position because we say, well, we're against crime or we're against illegalities because that's actually about hurting somebody. It's about doing a wrong. It's about doing something which is damaging that person's life. When you're talking about an institution which is designed to deliberately hurt somebody, I would say, well, you need to just justify that because the prison is a place which deliberately hurts somebody else. I do not believe that prisons have been justified morally.
What looks like it's going to work best in terms of rehabilitation are approaches in the community, getting people to get jobs, get skills, etc. What we need is people to be integrated into the whole of society, if at all possible.
Well, we have to have a broader argument about or debate about what is justice, what does justice mean, who gets access to justice, who doesn't get access to justice in the current climate. So the prison reform or radical transformation of the prison system has to be set in the context of the radical transformation of the criminal justice system itself.